Hi, everybody. Welcome to Mormonish. I'm Rebecca.
And I'm Landon.
And go ahead and say it, Jim. You're here with us so often, and I'm
I'm
Jim.
Jim. I'm unoriginal Jim.
That's it, unoriginal Jim. And, typically we don't have the same guest on 2 weeks in a row, but this is sort of a pop up podcast that became something much bigger than we even imagined. And it was very important to us and very timely that we get this out the day that we get it out. And you'll see why in a minute. But a lot of our podcasts start out like this. Hey, let's delve into this. And then we're like, oh my goodness, rabbit hole. And a week or so later, here we are. What we're going to be talking about today, of course, is the proclamation to the family, or the family, a proclamation to the world. It's called so many different things. The Family Proclamation. We butcher it like we do the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, right? But I'm sure it has not escaped your guys' notice that there have been so many articles in so many different news outlets, church owned, about the proclamation. And that's because it's the 30th anniversary. If you can believe that. I remember when it first came out. 30th anniversary. This is incredible. And of course, we all wondered, it's one of my conference predictions because conference is coming up this weekend. Would they dare? Would they canonize this? Meaning make it, legitimate scripture. It is something that's, a revelation, and, it goes into the canon of scripture of the LDS church. And a lot of us have been talking about this. Would they dare? It's been interesting because a lot of us know something about the origins of it, maybe some more than others, but some of the things we're going to talk about today, I guarantee a lot of you don't know as far as the origins of this proclamation. And this is, I think, going to blow your mind. What's interesting to me is that as we kind of delved into all these articles that have come out recently, Church News, LDS Daily Living, Deseret News about the proclamation, I've been kind of trying to keep track. One of them in particular went into detail on the events that led to the proclamation. I thought, well, this is interesting. How does the church say the proclamation came to be? So I kind of skimmed it, and then I left it because sometimes I do things other than Mormonish research. When I went back the next day, that article was gone. It said, sorry, what you're looking for cannot be found. So that's always interesting when they remove something within 24 hours of posting it. And again, it was an article in the Church News about how the proclamation came to be. So luckily, I came across someone who had taken screenshots, and we'll talk about this in detail later. But the screenshots showed a different kind of a story than what we're going to talk about today. And we're so glad that we have Jim, who is just this impeccable researcher. And like I said, we were just going to do a few little things here and there. And then it turned into like, we can't tape tonight because, we've got more to do, like a 3 or 4 day process, more than that for Jim. And even more importantly, now that President Nelson has passed away, and President Oaks, who is the champion of this document, what does this mean? And will something happen at conference? So with that little intro, I've already promised it's going to be mind-blowing as far as where this proclamation actually came from. Let's have Jim pull up your slides, and he's going to start with an awesome personal experience with the proclamation, which, oh my goodness, Jim, you have the stories to tell. Let's just say that.
I have a weird background. I was one of those people that fell like bass backwards into everything I did. I've been very lucky throughout my life, and the majority of jobs I've had, I've made for myself. So not too many people can say that, right? But the thing that makes me laugh about your mention of Oaks, I just forgot that he went and testified in front of Congress about the family. So he has always been the advocate for this. And you'll see as we go through this, a lot of the quotes about the proclamation actually come from him. So this is really his baby. So yeah, so what we'll start off with, before 2014, okay, I worked for an organization called the Lighted Candle Society, and it was a 501c3 in Washington, D.C. And what we did is, in Utah, we worked on anti-obscenity issues, pro-family issues. So a lot of anti-pornography research, a lot of anti-pornography lawsuits on behalf of, individuals whose families had been harmed. And then when Proposition 8 rolled around, we were very involved in Proposition 8. And so between really 2004, when I started with that group, and 2009 was all I did was live and breathe this stuff all day long. And so even when I left in 2009 and went back to school, all of my efforts were involved in apologetic efforts on the Proclamation of the Family, especially after the wake of Proposition 8. I had a blog called Testament of the Family, and I would go through and I would blog about all of this stuff, and I would make arguments as to why traditional marriage was superior. And so this was a foundational document for me. It literally made up my entire worldview. And any challenge to the family or traditional morality or anything like that for me would come right back to this document, and I would use it as a bludgeon to have conversations. So, hold on a second. There we go. So
And yet
this,
here you are today, I was going to say when I unmuted, right? That's what's
yeah,
just so, oh my gosh.
no, if you would have told me 15 years ago that I would hold the positions I hold now, I would never have believed you. So this is actually an article that I wrote with for Meridian Magazine back in 2013. Now, mind you, this is exactly a year before my deconstruction took place. This was like a year before the Sear Stone article came out. Okay. And so this article was written, and it was kind of a C.S. Lewis thing where I was writing an imaginary letter to a cousin who was a same-sex marriage advocate in the church, and the entire letter is me lecturing about how they aren't following the prophets. So, I'm going to read the first paragraph. These are my words, but what I want to make clear is this is the kind of rhetoric that comes with the proclamation of the family. This is what I believed. And this is what the people with whom I was associated believed. So much so that the proctors at Meridian Magazine were like, "We love everything you wrote. Let's publish it." Okay. So it says the state of affairs that follows on the heels of an apostolic defense of marriage that is unbroken from the time of Adam to Thomas S. Monson. This doctrine is most recently and clearly outlined in The Family, A Proclamation to the World, and countless other addresses. No matter the intellectual acrobatics that one might undertake to avoid it, marriage is God's eternal standard and it is His to define. Any action or philosophy we may espouse to the contrary in this ignorant present can only be seen as the whining of a petulant child or the height of ignorance. A few weeks ago, Elder L. Tom Perry said, "For a man to substitute his own rules for the laws of God on either end of life is the height of presumption and the depth of sin." Okay? And then I say, "I know you have told me that the church is politically and ideologically diverse body. However, I cannot see how that excuses those who seem to reject the prophet's lead on the issue of marriage." Okay? That was my hill to die on for a long time. Okay? So imagine my horror as I go through life when I find the rest of this other stuff out. So,
Do you still have
um,
people writing to you, like emailing and say, "Hey, that was amazing. I love what you
it,
wrote." A lot of other people that were
it,
apologists sometimes get
no,
that.
I
Oh,
was I was involved with the Tea Party movement there in Utah. Chris Cannon, the former congressman, he was a very good friend of mine. He was a mentor. I knew Cleon Skousen personally. I used to go to his house. And when Deb and I first met, we went to Cleon's house and I introduced her to Cleon, the whole nine yards. So that was the circle I rolled in. Um, but what I want to talk about today, understanding that the Proclamation of the Family is those things that for those of us who are in our 40s and 50s, this is a foundational document. When this rolled out, this was a very, very big deal. But the narrative that we were given about it is not a true narrative. It is a faith-promoting narrative, and it is a narrative that's designed to coalesce people's allegiance to the institution and to build up the foresight and knowledge of the leaders, but it's part of a pattern, and I'll show that. So the pattern is that in church history, you have these incidences where a church leader will read or learn about a contemporary issue that is problematic or threatening. Okay, a revelation comes forth. Okay, that addresses the issue to that population at that time. This proclamation that it's proclaimed. The revelation is ahead of its time, or it's proof of church authority, or it's proof that God speaks to his apostles and prophets and gives them foreknowledge, right? Um, we create these faith promoting narratives about the foresight of church leaders. This whole, prophet see around corners shtick that Sherry Do has right now. And then because you can't do this all the time, we end up repeating this process every few decades with different issues. So I'm going to give a couple of examples of how this works. And then my intention is to show that the proclamation of the family follows this exact same pattern. So, and what we can see is a lot of issues in church history are entirely derivative of publications, either near or exactly where Joseph Smith is located, or they found in public common discourse during his lifetime. Okay, so if you go back and you look at some of these major revelations, you find out that they're referenced in newspapers or in public meetings before these things ever take place.
Yeah, I think
Um,
borrowing was one of Joseph Smith's greatest skills, right?
yeah.
Borrowing, repurposing, repackaging, making it his own.
Well, somebody pointed out they called him a eclectic aggregator.
Oh,
And I don't know who said that, but I've always liked that term because it makes a lot of sense, right? He was pulling from different sources all the
right,
time. And that's what makes it difficult for people to place the Book of Mormon because, like, well, how could he have done this? Because he
right.
was brilliant, right? He must have been ADD because he was always looking at stuff all the time and pulling stuff together, right?
Yeah, that's
Um,
true. Did you have a thought, Landon? I thought you had a thought.
I was going to say it's amazing how much the God of Israel is tied to American politics and American going-ons.
well, what's the saying? You can always tell when you're creating God in your own image because he hates all the same people you do.
Yeah, there you go.
So this idea that these revelations could have been derivative from contemporary events and documentation runs contrary to the church's narratives that these revelations come as lightning out of the blue, or that they are there to address modern day issues and they show this interaction between prophets and God. Okay,
With a
but
lighted pen, right? I mean, we're literally taught from Wendy Nelson that it's happening, my dear.
that's right.
Please go out of the room. God is talking. And I'm right. I mean,
Yeah,
that's
it
really
happens in the middle of the
awesome.
night, not it takes years to develop and
Yeah.
years of politics and years of arguing back and forth and so many apostles having to die off before we get to a revelation.
Or the apostles that you don't want around, you're just going to send them to Europe.
Send them
Ezra
off.
Taft
Yep.
Benson. Yeah. All right, so let's talk about a couple of examples real fast. The first would be the word of wisdom. Okay, so contemporary issues and publications that were known in Kirtland at the time. So there was a temperance society in Kirtland before the saints ever showed up. Okay, temperance was a very big issue. And according to Dan Vogel, two things about the temperance society is important. One, it had more than 200 members in a very, very small community. So this was a big deal. Second, the distillery in Kirtland shut down because of lack of business. Okay. And so it shows that that is a very influential group. So February 26, 1833 was known as the National Day of Temperance in Kirtland, amongst other places. And that temperance society would have recognized the Day of Temperance. So they probably would have had meetings and get-togethers, okay? The word of wisdom shows up literally the day after, on February 27th, 1833. And what we find is the word of wisdom is entirely derivative of documents and ideas that were contemporary to the temperance movement. So the Simplicity of Health came out in 1830, and this elaborates on items that are in the word of wisdom. The Means of Providing Health came out. I think the Means of Providing Health was published in London, but it still had the same impact with temperance societies. And it contains every bit of the word of wisdom: the avoidance of alcohol, coffee, tea, tobacco, the sparing use of meat. Okay. The Journal of Health, I think it's one of the very first publications on this matter, was August 25th, 1830, and it contains aspects of the word of wisdom as well. And then, like I said, the Temperance Society in Kirtland. So you're in this environment, and the temperance is already in the air, and Emma doesn't like cleaning up tobacco spit. And I get the feeling that Joseph Smith, he liked to drink. We know he liked to drink, so he throws the word of wisdom out there, but he makes sure that he doesn't have to abide by it. And so at the beginning, it says, give by way of, greeting and not commandment, was his way of saying, yeah, I'm throwing this out there. It's the temperance movement is common. People can identify to this, but I like my whiskey and I like my cigars.
Well,
So that's, this is an example of contemporary influences. Okay. So the next,
we,
So
we,
what were
we
you going
all
to say,
heard the
Landon?
story of Emma, having to clean up the tobacco, and that's what led to
Right.
the word of wisdom. But is it possible Emma had just been at the National Day of Temperance in the Kirtland and had heard all about this? And that's what brought up, yeah, this alcohol and tobacco stuff isn't great, Joseph. We probably ought to give something. Uh, so you completely missed the backstory there. There seems to be more than just her cleaning up the tobacco spittoons.
yeah, I would agree 100%. It probably wasn't just Emma either. There was other women in the community who would have been there as well.
Yeah.
And
You
again,
know,
it's a perfect example of reinventing something, making it your own that already exists. It reminds me of a couple of years ago when President Nelson had the amazing idea of having a day of thanks. You remember this? And it was going to be toward the end of November. It was completely revolutionary, and everybody was supposed to post hashtag day of thanks to say something they're thankful for. Who had ever heard of anything like that before? And of course, I'm talking about this was Thanksgiving week. I mean, what's next? A day, third week of December, where you share gifts. And I mean, again, just making something your own and putting it out there as if you came up with it.
To be fair, if you woke up in the middle of the night with the idea to have a day of thanks, I would kick Deb out of the bedroom and I would write it down too.
That's right. It's happening.
It's happening, Deb. Get out. Okay, so the second example would be the Civil War prophecy. Okay, now this one, I actually did a TikTok on this just a little while ago because was it Fair Mormon had this apologetic up there, and the apologetic was like, well, Joseph Smith couldn't have known this, and it was ahead of its time. But what they didn't tell you is that there were newspapers talking about the nullification crisis that talked about civil war starting in South Carolina. So the Civil War prophecy comes about because the United States enacted a bunch of tariffs. Okay. And the governors of South Carolina and Georgia were threatening armed force and armed rebellion to nullify these tariffs. And this was a very, very big deal because this was states pushing back against the federal government, and it turned into a constitutional crisis. So while this is going on, in Paintsville, just not that far from where Joseph Smith was in Kirtland. Matter of fact, if you go to Cleveland now, you can see signs that say that say Paintsville this way, Kirtland that way. These were not far apart. They printed an article called The Crisis. And The Crisis talks about the probabilities of dismemberment, meaning the Union falling apart, stemming from the battles that were going on in South Carolina and Georgia over states' rights of nullification. And so the article was dated December 21st, 1832. It was published just miles away from Kirtland, and just 4 days later, Joseph Smith receives the prophecy, but he elaborates. It's not just a civil war; it's all this stuff and plagues and famine and the end of the world. This really apocalyptic, dark stuff. But the article itself invokes civil war. Okay, it says the entangling strifes and the dissolving of the most endearing relations of life is not the climax of its mischief, for it aims at once at armed resistance and civil war. That's a quote from the article. So you have this whole situation where this is going on, and this article was published almost a month in advance. So it shows up in New York State, it shows up in the New York Inquirer, it shows up in the Pittsburgh Gazette, it shows up in the Evening Post of New York. All throughout December. So December 8th, December 7th, December 20th, December 21st, multiple newspapers throughout the region. People talk in this period of time. They weren't as sheltered as they are. So this information was out there, and the Civil War prophecy was a reaction to what was published in the papers. Okay? So just a couple of examples of how prophecies in the LDS Church are influenced by contemporary events and then publications which kind of spread that information around. All right, so the top quote here on the screen, for those of you who are not watching, it says, "Good inspiration is based upon good information." Right? That's a quote from the master plan that we did last week, and it just makes me laugh because everybody gets inspiration when they have good information. Even an atheist, when he gets good research, he's going to go, wow, I just figured something out. So it's one of these things where people will say, oh, it's a spiritual statement. But no, it's common sense. When you have good information, you're going to make good decisions, right? So it's my proposition here that the Proclamation of the Family carries on this exact same tradition within the church of contemporary issues, the church getting these issues and then proclaiming their response to be ahead of its time and revolutionary and revelatory and authoritative. And then I've got this nice little picture of Sherry Dew, and it says, "Prophets see around corners." And I would like to add a subtitle, but only when those corners are already documented and published by other sources. So
I love that. I think they need to add that subtitle to the book in Deseret Books, because this is a book by Sherry Dew, "Prophets See Around Corners." Yep.
I would get a label maker if I wanted to get in trouble and just go through and do all that. All right. So just some giving credit where credit's due. Most of the historical overview information that we're going to discuss here is taken directly from Gregory Prince's books, Gay Rights and Mormon Church Intended Actions and Unintended Consequences. And then some of the information is also pulled from Benjamin Park's American Zion, A New History of Mormonism. So the next few slides, the data you see here, I don't have footnotes at the end of every page. Unless I say otherwise, it's coming from Gregory Prince, okay? Because his book is just absolutely phenomenal on this subject.
Right. And that's the point. There is information out there about the true origins of the
Yes.
proclamation. It has been out there ever since the proclamation came out. However, I guarantee when we tune into conference this weekend, we're going to hear another story, just like the story in the article that they put out and then retracted, just 24 hours later. You're going to hear something different. So if we pay attention here, you're kind of going to know what the true story is, right?
When we're done here, you will know more about the connections and social issues surrounding the proclamation than anybody else in Utah. So let's start off and what we're going to talk about. In 1993, okay, the issue of gay marriage really kind of came to the forefront. Okay, this was in the Hawaii case. It was Bear versus Llewellyn, and this case set the stage for the first time in the country to legalize same-sex marriage. Now, the church entered the public square on this and became a potent force for preserving what became traditional marriage. Okay.
And no one knows more about traditional marriage than Mormons. Yeah.
Yeah. The irony is not lost in the fact that we're one generation separated from people who are polygamists. And this is a church where the church leaders actively said that monogamy was the reason for the fall of Rome and was the source of prostitution. I mean, if someone wants to see it, I've got quotes out the wazoo from where church leaders attacked monogamy as the problem. But after 1890 and after the push for statehood and the push to get smoot in Congress, they had to rebrand. And the church rebranded as the super patriotic, America First kind of organization that we have now. Most people don't comprehend the original pioneer days, the days of 47. Those were not pro-American things. This was them celebrating the fact that they were no longer in America anymore, right? So Hawaii became a playbook for what the church would use for subsequent successful efforts to thwart marriage equality in other states.
And I think it's important to say that the marriage is another example of what we talked about earlier, where changes in revelation came over time because the church, in order to get statehood, needed a revelation to get statehood that polygamy couldn't be there anymore. And after years of talking to Congress and promising them that it was coming, a revelation came forth that ended polygamy.
Yeah, and it caused all kinds of fights too, because it doesn't present itself as a revelation. It
No.
presents itself as a memo. And so you had Mormons, Moses Thatcher and John Taylor Jr., who were actually excommunicated from the Quorum of the 12 because they refused to be a part of it. So it was a very ugly, ugly situation. All right, so in January of 1994, okay, this is after the first court case had gone to court in Hawaii. Affinity, the newsletter for LGBT Mormons and families, began to hear unsubstantiated rumors that the church was going to get involved in that court case. Okay, now less than a month later, the First Presidency puts out this statement, which you see on the screen. So this is from February 1994, and you'll read the bottom passage, which states, "We encourage members to appeal to legislators, judges, and other government officials to preserve the purposes and sanctity of marriage between a man and a woman, and to reject all efforts to give legal authorization or other official approval to support marriages between persons of the same gender." Okay, that is unequivocal. You cannot escape that. That comes from the First Presidency issued the following statement. Okay, so from that moment on, it's on all the way through Prop 8, all the way through just a few years ago. And we'll show how that cascades. So over the next year, the same-sex marriage battle kind of shifted it into high gear, and the church became convinced that Hawaii would either be unwilling or unable to mount a legal defense. And what the church was afraid of initially in their posts or their statements was that Mormon leaders, bishops and whatnot, would be sued and sued by individuals who wanted their marriages officiated by the church, but then the church would not officiate it. So in February 1995, the church petitioned the court to intervene in the case. They wanted to become a co-defendant to protect their rights as an institution. Now, I've thought about this a lot. The initial move for the church to get involved in this was not theological. The initial move was legal. They did not want to get sued. And what does being sued mean? It means finance. It means bad press. Okay. So the reason why we got into this, they built the theological arguments after. All right. And we'll see that in a second, because the theological arguments, they kind of blossom after 1995. Okay.
Yeah, the root is always money, isn't it? Go ahead, Landon.
Sounds like the steeple doctrine.
Yep.
They had a legal brief, a legal that they wanted a taller building, then they needed a theological case to support it. So,
and that steeple doctrine made me so mad.
Yeah.
Nemo killed it on that.
He did.
Okay, so in April 1995, the court denied the church's motion to intervene. Okay, and within hours, the church appealed it to the Hawaii Supreme Court. So they were not going to be left out of this. The church attorney, a guy named James Satter, fleshed out the deeper arguments for same-sex marriage. The arguments were common. They were common for the opponents of same-sex marriage, and it basically summed up in this one paragraph. It says same-sex couples lack the parenting skills of heterosexual couples, and some of their children will be condemned to a higher incidence of some social maladies, such as substance abuse, poverty, and violence. Children will also suffer from sexual identity problems because they lack a traditional role model. Okay. Now, this is interesting because what they're doing here is they're saying, well, I mean, I'm not going to go too far on this because I don't want to get off course. There are all kinds of cultures throughout history that did not have the traditional Western Christian family makeup. Okay. Even if you look at the Old Testament and the New Testament. Okay. I always laugh because our argument for marriage that we source to the New Testament doesn't exist in the New Testament. Christ doesn't talk about this. There is no family ceilings. Christ says that people can make themselves eunuchs for the kingdom. Castrate yourself. Paul's sexual ethic is not what we have now. And when you start talking about Paul's sexual ethic of marriage, it's like it was prophylactic. It was, you get married if you can't stay celibate. But celibacy is really the best way to go because God's coming soon and we don't need to have sex and kids. Right? I believe it was, one of the church leaders, Thomas Aquinas, I think, actually wrote a letter where he told a young woman that the greatest gift you can give to your parents is to not procreate. Okay? So this idea that we're defending is unique in history to us. All right? So, not to get too far off course. A Deseret News article showing up almost immediately after quotes Donald Hallstrom, who was the highest ranking church official in Hawaii, and he says the church takes a moral stand against homosexuality, but tries not to impede on the civil rights of individuals. We do not see this as a civil rights issue. We see this as a protection of traditional marriage. Okay. Now, when I was all in, that made a lot of sense. I was like, oh, this is a moral issue. It's not. Okay, this was splitting hairs, and they knew that, so it was very hard for them to stand up against it.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to say it's not a civil rights matter when it's the civil courts that give you a marriage certificate.
No, it's hard to say it's a civil rights issue when your argument is these people should not have the right to do something so that I can have my right untrampled.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, you have a right to be married, regardless of whether they allow gay marriage or heterosexual marriage. Heterosexuals still have that right. So your right is not being trampled on at all. In that case, you're simply allowing someone else the same right.
Yeah, and at which course they would pivot to saying that if you had same-sex marriage, it destroys the sanctity of marriage across the board. And I would make the argument, and this is the terrible argument that I made, that because of the way God set up marriage, and it was this procreative union that went on through eternity, there were levels of good, better, and best, right? And the proclamation of the family says that children are entitled to a mother and father, and that if we did not do what was necessary to give them the mother and father that God said they're supposed to have, then we are actually delivering them to subpar families, right? They're not as good as what they should have. That was an argument I made.
But
Yeah,
then
no, and that
again,
reminds me. Go ahead, Landon.
then again, it becomes a theological argument when you're saying this is what God wants. You're making it a theological and not a civil argument.
Absolutely. And
Yeah,
what,
and
what God,
I was going to say, it reminds me of when I was growing up, how race was viewed: good, better, best, right?
Yep.
Being valiant in the premortal existence had
Yep.
something to do with your race. And there was a good, better, best of your race when you came down to earth. So it's this whole idea. Yeah.
Yep. All right. So within months, the church began crafting the proclamation at the highest level. According to Elder Ballard, the proclamation was crafted by the Quorum of the 12. And he says the members of the 12 wrote that proclamation. It was considered word by the first presidency. Okay, word by word. Keep that in mind later. And according to Benjamin Park, I love this story. Rebecca, do you want to read this?
Yeah, sure. Via Benjamin Park, who's amazing, by the way, shout out. Boyd K. Packer, then the acting president of the Quorum of the 12, assigned Oakes, that's our current prophet, now that President Nelson has died, Russell M. Nelson, and James E. Faust in late 1994 to draft a scripture-based proclamation to set forth the church's doctrinal position on the family. Oakes later identified Nelson as the primary author, but rumors circulated that they had also consulted lawyers to craft a document that reflected contemporary legal disputes. They did not consult Relief Society leaders at all. And I will say right there that the article that I found and was pulled within 24 hours, this was just on the church news a few days ago, the one that said this is how the proclamation came to be, that article seemed to allude to that they had worked with the women in leadership, because there were pictures of Relief Society presidencies through the ages all over the article. And it seemed to make it sound that even though the women were told 3 days before their women's meeting that this was going to happen, that somehow they were involved in this prayerful process. And that is not true. And what we're going to read next proves this. They did not consult Relief Society leaders at all. This decision miffed I'm going to murder her name. Is it Chiko Okazaki?
Just say Sister Okazaki.
Yeah, Chieko. Oh my gosh, RFM's going to laugh.
Okazaki.
Okazaki. I knew it was Okazaki. It was her first name.
Sister Okazaki.
Sister Okazaki. Yes. A beloved, and she was beloved. She really was among women. She was the one. And tenacious Asian American counselor in the Relief Society presidency, who was the first person of color to hold any church-wide leadership position. When an apostle remarked, "Isn't it wonderful that President Hinckley made the choice to present the proclamation at the Relief Society meeting?" she retorted, "That was fine. But as I read it, I thought that we could have made a few changes in it." Because again, 3 days before, they'd already written their talks. They'd already put everything together for their women's meeting session of conference. They march this in, say, "Ladies, this is it. Here it is. Rework your talks. We're going to present this. Get on board." And then this article that was removed, it said, the women prayerfully considered this, but it makes it sound like it was something that had been happening, for months, if not years. No, it was 3 days right there. They were given that warning. So no input from, the majority of the members of the church, representative, right? Women, no input from women whatsoever in this document.
Let me riff on that for a second, because when
I
first learned that, this was hilarious. Okay. So you have a document that is being crafted by church leaders that was designed to respond to these legal contemporary issues. It also defines for an entire generation of women what their role in life is supposed to be. Okay? And it's handed to the women of the church by the men of the church saying, "Hey, guess what? We have defined your role. Here, boom, you've got it." Okay? Like, there was a time when the Relief Society was autonomous. There was a time when they had their own publications. There was a time that they had their own budgets. There was a time when they wrote their own articles. There was a time when the Relief Society was actually a women's group, right? And it had authority. During the First World War, it had national recognition. During the suffrage movement, it had actual recognition. And then when the time came for what's it called? Correlation. The priesthood, the male priesthood leadership goes, "We can't have these auxiliaries doing their own thing. We're going to bring them all underneath the guidance of the priesthood." So you have this women's organization, which is supposed to represent women, which is at the dictate of men. And this is an exact case of that. These women had no voice.
Right.
And
And
then
I
they
think we
went
should
out.
point out a lot of people think that the female leadership of the church report to the apostles or the prophet, like it's a direct chain. That is not at all how it works. They are under the auspice of a general authority. They meet in a committee with others and a general authority. They do not have a direct line or any power that goes beyond this committee with general authorities. This example is exactly what we're talking about. It's just window dressing, unfortunately, and being told what your eternal role is and your role, in this life is.
Yeah. You can't count money. You can't be a ward clerk. You can't hold your kids during a baby blessing. You can't do any of that stuff. You can't do anything that they used to, but gosh dang it, you're going to have kids into eternity. So,
Well,
sorry.
I think it's important to point out here that when it came out, it appears that the Relief Society president didn't see this as prophecy by the mere fact that she said, "I think we could make some changes to it." Therefore, she saw it for what it was, as just a legal document and a statement from the church on their position on families, and not as a revelation. And the fact that it was written by then junior apostles, Oakes and Nelson,
It's
is it
true, huh?
any wonder that it's become, important 30 years later when Nelson and Oakes have been in charge for the last, 15 years,
Yep.
that it's reached the level that it has. This was their baby. They wrote it. They prepared it. They need a legacy and something they can stand on, and they're going to use this proclamation as it.
Yes, absolutely. So this is from the BYU Religious Educator from 2023. It says, from President Nelson's biography, we learn that the Quorum of the 12 Apostles spent an entire day, sometime in 1994, discussing several issues surrounding the family, and notes that this was far from a new topic of discussion. This discussion continued beyond that day, with the 12 focusing on doctrinal issues, those that could not be changed, and policy issues, those things that might be changed regarding the family. And after this back and forth, this day-long debate or whatever, finally the decision was made to prepare a document, perhaps even a proclamation, to present to the first presidency for consideration. Okay, so
This was in 1994, right? That's what that says.
yeah,
So
but
that
we
that
we know it was 1990. Yeah, it was the end of 94, beginning of 1995.
that becomes important here a little bit later. And this is the same book where we learned about the spiral plane of death that we had a great episode with Jim on.
I read through the obituary and I was looking for anything I could find about, but it wasn't in there. I wonder if they watched the podcast and decided to pull it.
I still
Wouldn't be
see
the
it
first time.
mentioned.
Yep. All right. So in January 1996, the Supreme Court issues its ruling on the intervention, knowing that while Hawaii law allowed ministers to perform marriages, it did not require a minister to perform marriages, whether in accordance with a faith tradition or not. So, thus, no ministers could be compelled by the state to perform a same-sex wedding. The court also dismissed the church's allegations that if its officers who refused to perform same-sex marriages would be targets of credible lawsuits. And the language of the court was that the mere chance that a non-meritorious lawsuit may be filed against a party seeking intervention does not create the interest requiring intervention. So the Supreme Court says, there's nothing in this that's going to make you guys do these marriages. There's nothing in the law that makes you guys do marriages at all. And so you really don't have a leg to stand on in the case. Okay.
And so, as you were saying, this was their main concern. Can we be sued? We don't want our bishops to be sued for refusing to perform these marriages. So here it is. It ended up favorably as far as what their concern was: lawsuits, money, that kind of thing.
Oh, but they weren't done. The Family Proclamation was written too late to be employed in that motion to intervene, okay, in the Hawaii case. The proclamation was first used in the case in 1997 as an introductory to another amicus curiae brief. And this was after the district court trial. This happened in 1996. So while it had no effect on the outcome of the trial, the use of the proclamation as part of an amicus brief to the court, which is where the church says we are getting involved in this because of our interest in this issue, okay, went on for decades, and it maintains a virtual canonical status amongst church, despite never having been presented as revelation. I will say, it was never presented as revelation in conference. But what I'll show is that it has been presented as revelation in multiple other church publications. Okay. And
Yeah,
that's
I
where
feel like most members think that it was a revelation, or they feel that somehow it is. I think a lot of members would be surprised to
because
hear that it isn't already canonized. I think they feel that way.
yeah, well, it might as well be
Yeah.
because it is, right? So these are cases where the proclamation has been used, and you see it's in cases 97, 2010, 2011, 2013, two cases in 2014, a case in 2015, one in 2024, and one in 2025. Those are just the cases that I was able to find. There's probably more where they've introduced a proclamation. And what they do is they introduce it to the court as, this is what the church believes, this is its doctrine. These are the doctrines that are at risk if these issues are allowed to go over. And so it's a tool to allow them to insert themselves in the cases where they believe that their interest might be at risk. Now, according to the church newsroom, this is doctrine. Okay, so it says with divine inspiration, the first presidency and the Quorum of the 12 counsel together to establish doctrine that is consistently proclaimed in official church publications. This doctrine resides in the four standard works of Scripture: the Holy Bible, the Book of Mormon, Doctrine and Covenants, the Pearl of Great Price, and official declarations, proclamations, and articles of faith. Okay, so that's from the church newsroom in an article entitled "Approaching Mormon Doctrine." And that's where that message comes to. This is doctrine. This is promulgated by the Quorum of the 12. They've counseled together. The next, it's revelatory. Okay. So this is Boyd K. Packer. This is 2008 during a worldwide priesthood training broadcast. He says, a proclamation in the church is a significant major announcement. There have been very few of them issued since the beginning of the church. They are significant. They are revelatory. It is scripture-like in its power. And the speech in which he was talking about is entitled "The Proclamation of the Family." So he is saying revelatory and scripture-like in its power in direct reference to the proclamation in 2008. Now, later on in 2017, Dallin H. Oaks gives a talk where he goes through the way that the document was created. Okay, so he says the inspiration identifying the need for a proclamation on the family comes to church leadership 23 years ago. It was a surprise to some who thought that the doctrinal truth about marriage and the family were well understood. Nevertheless, he says, we felt the confirmation and we went to work. So the way he presents it is, there's some ambiguity out there. We feel confirmation. So confirmation means God's telling you something, right? So we felt, and we went to work. Subjects were identified. So evidently they went through and identified these things and discussed by members of the quorum for nearly a year. Now that's contradictory. Everything we know from the history shows that it came in 1994 after they lost that case. And they were assigned in 1994 and they picked it up in 1995. So according to him, they would have started writing this in October of much earlier. Okay.
Yeah, and that's important. That's important as far as where it came from. You know what it reminds me kind of is polygamy, right? So the angel comes to Joseph and said, this is needed. I'm not going to tell you exactly how. You work that all out, right? Angel comes to these guys, says, hey, we need something to solidify the family. Not going to tell you how or what. You guys work it out. So
figure it out.
If you call that a revelation, then that's a revelation. But to me, it looks like men working on stuff.
I actually was thinking the same thing, only slightly different, because the argument we always hear from the church on polygamy was, well, we were told to do it, but we couldn't really figure it out. They didn't say exactly how to do it, and so mistakes were made. Here they're talking about the family, which by this time everyone was already practicing, the modern family with one husband, one wife, and children. But somehow they had to put a lot of prayer and fasting and questioning into how to execute just one man and one woman. That had to be really defined through this proclamation. Yet with polygamy, we really didn't know what we were supposed to do, and so mistakes were made. But they didn't seem to put that much effort into polygamy.
Exactly.
We'll come back to that, because one of the things I'll show at the very end of this presentation is the ideas that they work on were already out there. All they did was add language to it, add
Yep.
more words. Okay. So he says language was proposed, reviewed, and revised. He says prayerfully, and we continually pleaded with the Lord for his inspiration on what we should say and how we should say it. We learned line upon line, precept upon precept, as the Lord has promised. And I want to point out the line upon line, precept on precept, if you read Isaiah, it's actually Isaiah making fun of people. It's not like a doctrinal thing. It's Isaiah's making a joke. So that's pretty funny. But he says, during this revelatory process, a proposed text was presented to the first presidency who oversee and promulgate church teachings and doctrines. After the presidency made further changes, the proclamation was announced by President Gordon B. Hinckley to the church. So we know they felt the confirmation to go to work. They looked at different issues. Language was proposed, reviews and revised. Now, that's all true. I have no doubt that they did all that. They pleaded with the Lord for inspiration. I have no doubt that they did that when they were looking for language. But this revelatory process, okay, at the end of it, they have this text that comes out of this very emotional, very trying, pleading with the Lord. That's the presentation here.
Well, and one of the things we always hear, especially from post-Mormons, is the proclamation was written by lawyers, right? And I used to even kind of say that until I dug in and realized nobody knows exactly. It seems to be sort of a combination of this process from the apostles, who some of them were lawyers, right? And perhaps other legal professionals saying, we're going to use this. This is what we need in here. This is what we need to show, it's our core values, our needs, so that it can be used legally. So I think it was a combination. What do you think, Jim? Because I hear a lot of post-Mormons saying lawyers wrote it, and that is not exactly accurate.
No, it's not. I mean, it came about because they were looking for clarification on these issues. But the impetus of it, the reason why it came to be to begin with, was because of court cases.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't have, it seems to me, after reading through everything, that they didn't have standing in the Hawaii case. And so the proclamation was crafted so that they could introduce that as basically saying, these are our beliefs, these are our doctrines, and this is what's at risk for us as an institution if these issues go unchecked. Okay. So you would have had the church leaders looking at these issues and writing these issues out, but you also would have had them presenting it to Crichton and McConkie saying, if we go to court, how does this language sound? Okay. And it would have been crafted that way. So
this is no different than every corporation in the world that does business. When you say, "Gal, this stuff is hurting us. We need to write something up that says, what action we're going to take, or what action we need from our legislator," and you have your lawyer. The CEO says, "This is what I need." He assigns it to a committee or to somebody who writes it up. It's reviewed by the lawyers. It's reviewed by the management. They reword it. They make, and then they submit it to the court or to their lobbyist or whoever they're going to present it to use to further their interests. And that's it. That's what this was. It was an amicus brief. Whether lawyers fully wrote it, the president of the church said, "I want this. Let's develop it," but it's going to be used as an amicus brief for these legal cases, and therefore it is a legal document, or their intent is to use it to influence legislation.
Yeah, legislation, court cases, I mean, all of it. So, I just had a funny thought. How funny would it have been during the 1880s if the church had submitted D&C 132 to the courts as proof that they should be able to practice polygamy? That's basically what this is, right?
Yep.
That's a great analogy.
Time,
yep.
Right.
No, that's great.
So this is the Ensign, November 2005, the proclamation, a 10-year milestone, right? So it says, speaking of the proclamation, Elder Russell M. Ballard of the Quorum of the 12 said, "It was then and now a clarion call to protect and strengthen families, a stern warning to the world where declining values and misplaced priorities threaten to destroy society by undermining the basic unit. A warning ahead of its time, the proclamation was issued before society at large recognized the extent of the decline of the family." Okay? So again, back to that pattern. Identify a social issue, create a revelation that addresses the issue, market it as ahead of its time. It's the proof of the foresight of the leadership. We're going to do one more of these quotes. This is from September 2020, the 25th anniversary. Okay. In this one, Elder Ballard says that the proclamation was ahead of its time in defending traditional family values. All right. Its clear and simple language stands in contrast to society's confusion and convoluted definition of family, which is hilarious because the definition of family has always been convoluted. Culture to culture, these things don't carry. It's like there is no monolithic static standard of, but the argument is the one I used to make as an apologist is this is God's revelation. God is revealing the family, and all the other cultures that did it different, they didn't have God, right? Therefore,
Well,
their families were subpar.
I'm laughing because just 100 years before, it was society who was telling the LDS Church, you can't have 13 wives. You can't do that. It's wrong. It's one of the pillars of barbarianism.
Yep.
And now they're declining because there's some divorce. The divorce rate's higher. Is that what their complaint is? Oh, no. A man and a man are getting married. That is now the problem. But when we had 13 wives, society was wrong. But now we're the beacon. We know what God wants. Every time God tells us what a family's supposed to be, the whole rest of society should change and become just like what we say it should be.
It's so fascinating too, because I'm gonna go off on a little tangent here. When you look at the In Sacred Loneliness, right? Or you look at Mormon polygamy, a history, right? You read these books. What you see is that in Mormonism, marriage was not an institution about love. It was not an institution about two people coming together to create a family. It was an institution about women being sealed to patriarchal leaders to build their family unit. These women were not partners. They were not spouses. A lot of them were miserable their entire lives, and the majority of them didn't have the same amount of children in a family unit that their monogamous counterparts did. Right. So this whole thing of marriage being this family unit and the father and all and the love and all this stuff, that is a post 1900 creation in Mormonism. Right. The way it was patriarchal, and it was women were property. Right. They were acquired. Fathers would hand their daughters over to the prophet, and the prophet would approach them and say, okay, well, do you believe in a prophet? Because if you don't take this marriage from me, heaven's closed against you forever. Sorry. Right. Marriage and love was not a Mormon institution before they had to rebrand after polygamy. So the arguments that they're putting out here, warning about the traditional family, they're protecting something that they didn't even represent. Essentially,
Not only didn't represent, but in 2020, both Nelson and Oakes are polygamous in their belief. They both have two wives who they believe not at the same time on earth, but they both believe that they will be in heaven with two wives, and yet they're defining marriage as only between one man. Well, they say a man and a woman, which leaves it open. They don't say one man and one woman. Why don't they say that? But at this point, both of these men have two wives that they believe they will be with as husband and wife in the afterlife.
Yeah.
And if you think about it, the LDS traditional family of up to the 1880s or so, it was called the Mormon problem by the US government, by everybody. It was seen as obscene, right? It was not a reflection of the traditional values of the United States. And I kind of feel when they talk about the way they talk about the nuclear family, the LDS Church leadership is obsessed with the 1950s. Like you said, Jim, post-war, right? They are obsessed with that, Donna Reed, which was one of my favorite shows, the 50s, Leave It to Beaver. They are obsessed with that nuclear family, just like they're obsessed with 1950s hotel architecture for temples. I don't know where that comes from, but they are trying to just hold on to that as tight as they can.
Well, even the language in the Proclamation of the Family sets out that the man is the provider and the woman is the nurturer. So the nuclear family concept of the 1950s shows up in that document because the people that wrote it were from the 1950s. Exactly. So, all right, let's keep rolling on here. But wait, there's more. So now we're going to pivot a little bit, and we're going to talk about the contemporary influences and documents which were going on at the exact same time that the Proclamation of the Family was building. Okay, so we're going to roll back the clock here a little bit and take a look.
This is going to blow your mind. This part right here. If you had to fast forward through everything else, stop right here and pay attention to this document on the screen, because this is something that I don't think a lot of people are aware of, and it blew my mind.
So this is the Family Manifesto of 1988, and we're going to dig into this because there actually is, I think, a Fair Mormon article saying that the Proclamation of the Family has nothing to do with this. Okay, I think they're out there. They've already got a hint of blood in the water here, but we're going to make it very difficult for them to argue, which is one of my favorite things to do to Fair Mormon. In the 1980s, rights for the LGBTQ community were were a big enough issue that it was even cited in the Salt Lake Tribune as being part of the Republican platform. Okay, so this quote comes from the Salt Lake Tribune of July 5th, 1982, and it says the Republican platform denies homosexuals the rights to activities such as adopting children, being an agent in the CIA, and handling state secrets. And then the quote from the GOP is, our delegates are concerned about the recent movement to legitimize homosexuality. I agree the planks is broadly drafted, but it is intended to register the party's view. The platform does not deny rights to homosexuals on all counts, only those areas which have historically been denied to homosexuals. Okay? So the question is, why, if there was this idea that if you were a homosexual, your moral compass was internally and irrevocably broken. You could not be trusted with state secrets. Why? Because you were a homosexual. You couldn't be in the CIA or the FBI. Why? Because you were a homosexual. Adopting children? Oh no, you're going to corrupt them because you were a homosexual. Okay? It was seen as deviancy. Okay? And there was this thing that Cleon Skousen talked about how J. Edgar Hoover would weed homosexuals out of the FBI. Okay, so if you were homosexual, you were seen to be broken from the start. Your moral compass was inherently broken. Okay, so marriage, absolutely not. Adopting children, absolutely not. Having a job that allowed you to serve your country, absolutely not. It wasn't until I think 1994 that Don't Ask, Don't Tell shows up, so they couldn't serve in the military. Okay. So it was in the GOP platform, 1982, Chuck Ackerlow. You'll see his name show up again. That's the quote. Okay, so we know that in Utah, this was an issue even then. Okay, so LGBT issues were around the country, a budding issue, really since the Stonewall riots in 1969. But by the time you get to 1979, you have your first March on Washington for gay and lesbian rights. And this has the attendance of about 75,000 to 125,000 people. By 1982, Wisconsin becomes the first state in the nation to make it unlawful for private businesses to discriminate based upon sexual orientation for employment and housing. Okay. 1983, Jerry Studs becomes the first openly gay member of Congress. He came out in 1983. I actually think he was outed. I don't think he did it on purpose, but I think he was outed. 1984, Berkeley City Council passes a domestic partnership policy to offer benefits to employees of same-sex relationships. Being the first city in the U.S. to do so. And so you can see as we're moving through, there's small efforts for legitimacy, for social equality, for recognition. By the time we get to 1985, West Hollywood enacts a domestic partnership registry. And 1986, this is a big weird one, Bowers versus Hardwick in 1986. Upholds a decision that criminalizes specific sex acts for consenting adults. And I'm not going to talk about which ones those are. You can probably use your imagination, but they were illegal in the United States. And it wasn't until Lawrence v. Texas comes along that the legal sanctions against specific bedroom behavior by adult individuals of consenting age and relationship status are finally overturned. And then 1987, Barney Frank becomes the first member of Congress to voluntarily identify themselves as gay. Okay, so that takes us from 1979 clear up to 1988. Okay.
I want to just make a point on the previous slide where the church guy said that, or the Republican Party guy said that, these are rights that have historically been denied to homosexuals. I just looked it up because I thought this was true. J. Edgar Hoover was not married, never had any children, and was very cozy with one of his lieutenants in what most people would say their relationship took place of a marriage for both of the men. So this goes back.
It's
back
ironic.
to the 50s at this point. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, when Cleon Skiles would talk about that, and he and I talked about it quite a bit, he would say that it was because Hoover's position was that he could never properly have a wife because the FBI took up so much of his time in his life. All right, so that was his defense. But yeah, you're absolutely correct. There was accusations of that going up and down. I don't think anybody ever proved anything specifically, but I know that they accused him of cross-dressing too. I think that shows up in Simpsons quite a bit. Okay, so 1987, Barney Frank becomes first member of Congress. What we can see is years and years of small efforts in society to chip away at the social stigmas, to give this community more recognition, more opportunity, and to basically be good humans to allow other people to be good humans. Enter Jerry Falwell. In August of the moral majority
Moral
and the
majority,
family
yep.
manifesto. So in August 1988, Jerry Falwell and his moral majority held a conference in New Orleans called the Family Forum 88.
This is in 1988.
Yep, I was just going to say that.
Family Proclamation. When did we hear? 1994?
95.
94, 95.
7 years
we're
before?
7 years before the proclamation to the family ever is thought of.
So one of the major elements of this conference, now this conference took place just before the Republican National Convention and just before the Democratic National Convention. Okay, in the same town. This was New Orleans. So you had the moral majority. They have this conference. All the evangelicals get together. They meet with their legislators. They meet with their delegates. So one of the major elements of this event was to put together a document that would be used for evangelical and legal policy purposes to define the family as an essential element of Christian thought in society. Okay?
But I feel like you should read that again. I mean, obviously, God spoke to Jerry Falwell and the moral majority first and said, we need this document, right? Then he went over to Salt Lake and visited the Mormons and said, yeah, we also need a document from you.
Well, here's the thing. This sounds like that society had already identified some of the issues with marriage. It doesn't, I mean, anyway, we'll get into that. I'm going to let the viewers make up their own mind of where this sits, right? But I know where I sit, and I'm very skeptical. Okay. Fundamentalist Journal, Volume 7, Number 9, October 1988. Family Forum 88 sets a pro-family agenda. The 3-day summit conference was geared towards setting a pro-family agenda concerning the courts, the economy, education, and social issues. A highlight of the conference was the presentation of the Family Manifesto. This 4-page landmark document issues a new call to action for the pro-family movement and outlines the beliefs in America's moral conservatives concerning the family. In addition to being distributed at the summit, the document was also made available to the delegates at the Republican National Convention. Its contents laid the foundation for Family Forum 88. I need to state, the document was also made available at the Democratic National Convention too. Okay, I didn't find that out till I was reading some more this afternoon. Okay, so both parties received copies of this. The Democrat Party kind of pushes it aside because by the mid 80s and late 80s, the Democratic Party is open to courting the votes from the homosexual lobby. And I hate to say the term homosexual. I don't like to say that. It sounds negative, right? The LGBT population. Okay. To say homosexual lobby makes it sound like this group that's kind of nefarious and planning off at the side. It sounds very Rush Limbaugh in its tone. So I don't want people to think that's the way I use that term, but that's the way it was defined then.
You're speaking historically, kind of using the verbiage. So, and again, everybody think back to that slide where we showed you the document. It is called the Family Manifesto. What's a synonym for manifesto in my mind? Proclamation.
The proclamation.
Family Manifesto. Family Proclamation. And this document is going out to everyone, as Jim is going to show, in 1988.
Yep. Okay, so this is the first page of the Family Manifesto. And you can see even the presentation of this is very similar to the Proclamation of the Family. Okay, the way it's written, the font, the whole 9 yards. And if you want to find a copy of this, you can find a copy of it. Just Google Family Manifesto 88, and it'll pop up on the Liberty University website. It's got all 4 pages. You can go through it. At the end of this presentation, we're going to present a side-by-side analysis that wasn't done by us. It was done by somebody on Reddit. So I can't take credit for the side-by-side. But we'll talk about that here in just a second.
Part of me that's really kind of snarky wants to take that manifesto and like post it and say, hey, I was just reading over the document, see if anybody notices that it's not the proclamation, right? Because
I would just say, hey, I've got a leaked copy of the new Family Proclamation. Yeah. The church is going to put this out and send it out there to see how it works. Yeah. So go on, Landon. Sorry.
I said absolutely. Everyone that would read it, if they thought it was coming from the church, would say, "Oh, this is straight from God. I can believe it. I'm on board."
Yeah, because it sounds so similar, right? So, the Family Manifesto was national news. Okay. So if I did a search for it. So this is let's see here, the Associated Press from July 8th. So they knew that this document was coming months in advance. The conference took place in October. In July and August, we knew that this was coming down the pipe. So July 18th, 1988, the Associated Press, in an article entitled "Falwell Family Forum is a Smokescreen for the Morality Movement." This article says, Falwell's manifesto is a 4-page document proclaiming the family, the fundamental institution of society, and an immutable structure established by our Creator. Okay? July 88. August 88, another article talking about the fact that this document was going to be published, states family issues on the political stage. They have issued what they call a family manifesto. It starts by proclaiming how the family-oriented people see themselves. The family is the fundamental institution of society. It is defined by relationships of blood, marriage, and permanent legal adoption. The manifesto asserts the diversity, dignity, and complementary value of male and female, rejecting the trendy androgyny. It even proclaims the once common sense but now radical proposition that in a family with children requiring nurture, the role of the male is the provider and the role of the female is one of nurture. The manifesto comes out loud and clear for marriage as a covenant of divine origin, not merely a status of sex partnership.
Are you sure this wasn't put out by the AP about the Family Proclamation?
Trust me, I read this and I had to double check it. I asked my kids to make sure I was right. They told me I was, so we're good. It was Smith Clan approved.
7 years prior, but this is exactly what I would expect to see about the Family Proclamation put out 7 years later in 1995.
Now, mind you, I don't think the Family Proclamation received national news.
Yeah, I don't think so, because there already was one, right? Yeah. Only Mormons didn't know. Yeah.
So this is a couple more articles. So this is the news in advance. This is from July 1988. Falwell's Family Forum opens, and it talks specifically. Falwell distributed copies of the organization's Family Manifesto, a 4-page document proclaiming the family a fundamental institution of society, denouncing abortion and calling for equal government treatment of communities and religious schools. Another article here, was front page. This actually shows Jerry Falwell holding a copy of the Family Manifesto on the front page of page 13, of the Atlanta Journal, July 15th, 1988. Okay. And it says Reverend Falwell holds a copy of his Family Manifesto as he launched Family Forum 88 in Atlanta. Okay.
Did all the evangelicals cross-stitch this and hang it on their wall in their house?
I think they superimposed it with pictures of a guy from Orem who looks like Jesus, and they had really soft lighting in the background, and their entire family in matching denim on bales of hay in the same picture.
Oh,
there you go.
That sounds accurate. I had a copy of the proclamation. It was like etched into wood. So It was like this wooden plaque, and long after I'd stepped away, it was still on my wall. It was in a place that it didn't really show on something else that was wood. And one day I walked by it and I went, what is that still doing there? And I took it down and I thought, okay, if I knew how to burn something, I would. But, I
I'll be
failed
honest
that
with you.
class at girls' camp. I did not know how to burn it. So I just kind of threw it in the trash and I put up a picture of my dog instead. But I just, everybody has these in their homes. You're right. The cross stitch, the etched into wood, the watercolor. It's just, and flags. We've seen that recently too, especially here in Utah during Pride Month, where people display their pride flags. People more and more are starting to display family proclamation flags as sort of a countermeasure. So this to me is only taking off and getting more steam, but nobody knows where it really came from. This, like I said, this blew my mind.
So between 1988 and 1990, articles in newspapers discussing Falwell's manifesto were fairly common. I did a search for it. I found at least 53 nationwide that discussed the family manifesto. However, in Utah, only one newspaper discusses the manifesto. Only one. And it was in St. George. It was the Daily Spectrum in August of 1988, before it was fully announced at the October conference. And it was written by Phyllis Schlafly, who was well known. She was a friend of Cleon Skousen's. She worked with the Eagle Forum with Gail Ruzicka out there in Utah. She worked with the Freeman Institute with Cleon Skousen. So very right-wing Catholic writer. Now, what's interesting is all of the proclamation to the family rhetoric is before its time. There's a quote from Ballard where it was before society identified the threat to the family. What I want to point out is in Utah publications. So if you go to newspapers.com, get a subscription, you can search newspapers by state. Utah publications covering the issue of homosexual marriage show up more than 1,300 times between 1982 and 1993. So the idea that this was ahead of its time, that it was before society identified the issues, all this stuff is blatantly false. 1988, the Falwells were addressing these issues. We had the March on DC in '79. You had multiple homosexual. Sorry, I keep saying that. I hate the way it sounds. LGBT community individuals coming out in Congress, in other places, prominent individuals. You guys like Elton John, who showed up as being that way. Being that way, being outspoken and verbal. So this idea that it was ahead of its time, that it was before society identified the threat to the marriage, the newspapers in Utah were talking about this from 1982 onwards. It was part of the GOP platform to make sure that these individuals were denied areas that had historically been denied to them. Okay? So that narrative is false. The evangelicals were addressing this issue long before the LDS Church tried to get legal standing in a case in Hawaii. Okay.
I was going to say it's hard to argue that you were ahead of your time when the proclamation came out too late for the case that you were trying to write it for.
No, they're completely reactive, as always. There's nothing prophetic. It's reactive. And there's example after example. The priesthood ban, the lifting, reactive, right? To everything that's happening socially. COVID, the reaction to COVID, it's reactive. It's after the fact. It's after everything has been said and done. Then they will weigh in once things shake out, right? There's never anything that's forward thinking, revolutionary, or prophetic, if I can say that. It's all reactive and after the fact. And then the members are gaslit to believe, yes, this, we said this ahead of time. And, as time goes by, then people don't realize the details. So we're so glad you have this documentation, Jim, because this absolutely shows what was happening.
So let's take this a step further. At the 1988 Republican Convention, this document was circulated. So let's think, how many of the delegates at that convention had access to this document? And do we know who any of them were?
These are Utah delegates.
These are just the Utah delegates.
Okay,
right.
Just Utah. Okay. So this doesn't include Idaho delegates,
Nope.
Arizona delegates who also would have had large LDS, California possibly some.
This is just Utah. So of the delegates, you have Colleen Bangerter, you have Norm Bangerter,
governor,
you have Orrin Hatch, who had been in the Senate since 1976, John Huntsman Jr. of the Huntsman family. You had T.H. Bell, who was the Secretary of Education under Reagan. You had other, semi-celebrities like Bruce R. Hoff and others. But if you look at this list on the screen, and for those of you who can't see it, there's a bunch of people. 32 of the delegates to the Republican convention in 1988 who would have had access to copies of this document are all LDS. Every single one of them. And these are people who were openly involved in Utah politics. They would have been involved in the conversations about LGBTQ rights and issues within the state. And a lot of these people, because they're all LDS, and they were business leaders, they were heads of companies, they were all kinds of. You don't send Joe Blow from the street to your convention. Okay, you send people who have some amount of gravitas, some amount of pull, right? People who are vocal, people who are advocates. You want the people who are going to come back to the state, who are going to advocate for what the party wants to happen. Okay. So you can see on the screen, we had numerous people who had access to this document at the convention. Norm Bangerter was the governor, Hatch was a senator, Huntsman was a business leader. We know that every single one of these people received a copy because it was handed out. We know that LGBT issues in Utah were an issue because it shows up in the party platform that Chuck Ackerlow, who you see on the screen, defended. We know that the church was interested in it, okay, because you had ties with all this stuff going on. So it's very difficult for me to believe that the church can be looking at these issues and this can be in the press and this can be covered in national news and it can be everywhere it is, and have the leadership of the LDS church who literally have people everywhere. They have these get-togethers where they come in, and you used to see it with Elder Gong. And there's a clip out there of him doing a news brief to the church. And he's talking about the legal issues and ramifications of certain things, right? So we can show it was in the news. It was national news. It was picked up by the Associated Press. It was, trumpeted by major evangelical groups. It was distributed at the Republican convention, the Democratic convention. Copies were given to the LDS delegates at the convention in 1988. And then there's another layer I want to add on to this. Any thoughts
So
on
the
that?
idea, if someone were to say, well, that might have happened, that document, but our leaders worked with God in a vacuum, completely divorced from this document and created that just doesn't fly at all. More likely is kind of like what we talked about last week. Remember, Jim, where the church sees something like, hey, the Vatican, that's a center of Christianity. I think we need that, right? Same kind of thing. Hey, the Jerry Falwell crew, they've got a manifesto. We need a proclamation. I mean, that's completely how I see it happening.
Yeah. So let's add one more layer onto this. Did the Mormons know the manifesto existed? Well, yes. I've shown that in the previous, at least high-level ranking business leaders, Republican Party members, individuals who would have been associated with it. Because Edward Taft Benson was president of the church at the time. Mm-hmm. His health was failing, right? But Mormonism and Republicanism were very much hand in hand during the 1980s. And I remember sitting at Cleon Skousen's house and him going off about how bad Hugh B. Brown was because he was a socialist. Okay, so there was very, very much this animosity. And when I was growing up in the 90s, we were told that you could not be a Mormon and a Democrat because James Mathewson, I think he was a Mormon, but he was always under this kind of stigma for being a Democrat. And look at Harry Reid. I have family members who still refuse to admit that Harry Reid could possibly be Mormon because he was a Democrat. Okay, so we know that the Republicans and high-level Mormon Republicans in the LDS Church conversed all the time. So,
can I ask you one question, Jim? You keep mentioning, how you were at Cleon Skousen's house or talking to him. Maybe you should explain to our viewers and listeners that you do have this relationship.
I did. So my relationship with Cleon came because I worked for the Light of Candle Society. I was a researcher. And the founder of the Light of Candle Society was a guy named John Harmer. And John Harmer was the Lieutenant Governor of California. He was a senator in California from Glendale. And he was a major anti-pornography attorney. He was one of the founders of the National Center for Constitutional Studies. with Cleon Skousen. He took it over as president when Skousen left. He was very attached to and close to Edwin Meese of the Heritage Foundation. I actually met Meese before he passed away. And so that's how I came about. John introduced me to Cleon, and we just kind of hit it off. I asked him questions, and at one point I was, in his house in his basement, like going through documents with him, and I have handwritten copies of his last book. And I worked very closely with Paul Skousen. John was he was an amazing man. I owe a lot to John. I don't agree with a lot of what he did now, right? But I owe a lot to him in that he was somebody who gave his entire life on something that he genuinely believed in. And he was very kind. And Cleon was the same way. Cleon loved to teach. You would go to his house and he would sit and he would talk to you and he would stand with his hands behind his back in front of the fireplace. He was a very warm, kind person. But if you look at the results of some of his rhetoric, it's not so good, right? It's very nationalistic. And what we find is that the moral majority used documentation that Cleon produced in the 1980s. So Falwell and Cleon were very, very close. So at one point in my life, I was 1 degree of separation from Ronald Reagan and 1 degree of separation from Jerry Falwell, based upon the two people who were my primary mentors. So much so that when I was working for John, we had an office in the Eagle Gate building right across the street from Temple Square. And he was traveling. He worked for Biden and Belair. So one of his legal partners was Joe Biden's son. And the phone rings. I pick it up. John Harmer's office, and this lady gets on the phone. She asks if John's there. I said no. And John came back a few days later, and he didn't have a cell phone. And so I would put notes on his door. And he comes back, and he pulls this note off, and he's like, "Jim, when did this person call?" I said, "A couple days ago." He goes, "If anybody calls from this number again, you get a hold of me." I said, "Well, who was he?" He goes, "That was Nancy Reagan."
Oh.
And so that was the circle I ran in. Now, when I was working with the Skousens and Paul, I ended up getting into a circle with Rick Kerber, who ended up being a huge fraud person. So I was right there to watch Rick Kerber go down. So that was I have, like I said, I have a very odd history. I've been very, very lucky in this. So Cleon was a friend. I have signed books from him. I don't agree with his rhetoric or his teachings now. I think it's simplistic and false. But as a person, he was a very good person, at least very kind to me and my wife.
But he was close to Jerry Falwell. That's kind
very
of
close. Yeah, one degree. Yeah, so 1 degree of separation.
Would have known, obviously, about this whole manifesto movement. We can probably assume he did.
Yes. So conservatives like Cleon Skousen were publicly endorsed by Falwell's moral majority going all the way back to the early 80s. Falwell and Skousen were well known to each other. It said that they were friends. They did rallies in the 1970s and 1980s, and newspaper articles referred to them as close personal friends. The Review of Religious Research, published in 1985, identifies connections between the two groups. It says Mormon-inspired and controlled groups in Salt Lake City more than once have hosted representatives from Falwell's moral majority, including Falwell himself, as explored mutual interest and overlapping positions. In other words, Mormons represented part of the old Christian right in North America have been busy building bridges of religio-political with the new Christian right, which the moral majority represented. And then I think I have another quote in here. I don't. There's another quote in here from or that I found from one of the heads of the Freeman Institute, which was Skousen's group, where he talks about the fact that Falwell's moral majority used to use the Miracle of America, Skousen's textbook on American history, as part of their curriculum. So the Skousens and his followers and everybody in Utah from the political groups would send information to Falwell. Falwell came and spoke in Salt Lake City. They were very connected. So what I want to show here is documents that have the idea of defending the family existed at least 7 years, 1988, before the church ever comes up with the Proclamation of the Family. We know that copies of the Family Manifesto were given to LDS representatives and high-ranking Utah businessmen and party members at the 1988 Republican Convention. We also know that it was given to people at the Democratic Convention as well. It shows up in national newspapers as part of the national discourse in 1988-89. And then we know that through Skousen and other conservative groups in Utah, that there's a connection between the political aspirations and need to defend traditional values of the moral majority and Mormons in Utah. Okay. And this, by the way, carries very closely over to the support in Utah for people like Charlie Kirk, because Charlie Kirk started the Fall Kirk Foundation with Jerry Falwell Jr. All right. And if you look, so think of that dynamic where you have Mormons who are very conservative, they're very right wing, they're very traditional family, they're getting involved with these narratives that support their biases. All right. And, if you want to consider how that works, just think about Utah politics, and their support for Charlie Kirk is kind of the same way as it would have been for the Falwells. Only during the 1980s, Mormons were still very prejudiced against Baptists, and Baptists still very prejudiced against Mormons. So the fact that Utah newspapers did not pick up on the existence of the Family Manifesto makes a lot of sense, because outside of the political, the political connections and the fellow traveler nature of the political causes, most Mormons didn't care about what the Baptists were doing. But when it came to legal issues and court issues, the Mormons and the Baptists, like the Falwells, they agree on almost everything.
Right.
Okay.
Unlikely bedfellows, I think is what
Unlikely
they call it.
bedfellows.
And you were kind of saying that Cleon Skousen, he had access to the apostles, the brethren, he was in the upper echelon. People knew of him, his work. I mean, my parents were Bircher Benson Skousenites, right? So, to me, Skousen, hand in glove with all the upper leadership. I feel like what he was aware of, he was kind of a conduit perhaps from,
That's right.
Faldwell, Baptist, what they were doing to the leadership. So,
Now,
to me, that's a connection, at least a possible connection.
Well, let me be clear. I did reach out to what's his name?
Matt Harris.
Matt Harris.
Yeah.
And I asked him if there was connections between Benson and Falwell. And Harris's response was, look, by the time we're into the 1980s, Benson's health was very, very low. Cleon's was not, however. And so Benson may not have been involved, but he was definitely involved in Bircher material. He used to send Bircher pamphlets to general authorities and people all over the place. So I can't show where the Family Manifesto is handed off to a member of the 12. I can't show where they used it. I can't say, well, they had a copy of this, they took it into a back room. It's kind of like, did Joseph Smith have scriptures available? Yeah. But what we can show is where the Family Manifesto has the exact same ideas. The difference between the two documents is where the statements in the Family Manifesto are kind of vague. The Proclamation of the Family takes those same ideas and turns them into paragraphs, almost like they're Egyptian hieroglyphs. So let's look at this. So this is a comparison. And so I think we should just go do these one at a time, right? So I'll go ahead and do the first one. Okay. So the first side on the left-hand side of the screen is the Family Manifesto from 1988. The right-hand side of the screen for me is 1995, the Family Proclamation. So I'll go ahead and read the first one, and Landon, I'll let you read the second way. We can kind of go through it that way. 1988, we proclaim that marriage is a covenant of divine origin, whose purpose, by divine intent, is the mutual support and assistance of spouses, the procreation, nurture, and education of their children. Now, the Family Proclamation. We solemnly proclaim that marriage between a man and a woman is ordained of God, and that the family is central to the Creator's plan for the eternal destiny of his children. Okay.
It's like they put it through Chat GPT and said, rewrite this different, but better, but a little more solemn, right?
Well, more accurately, they ran it through Crichton and McConkie and said, how do we flesh out this language to really illustrate our beliefs so we can use it in court? So, Landon, go ahead and read the second one.
Yeah, I love this one. So the Family Manifesto, we proclaim that male and female were established by the Creator in their diversity with equal dignity and complementary value. The Church's Family Proclamation, all human beings, male and female, are created in the image of God. Each has a divine nature and destiny. Gender is an essential characteristic of individual premortal, mortal, and eternal identity and purpose. No, notice on this that the evangelicals said that male and female were established with equal dignity and complementary value. They're equals. Yet the LDS had to change that and had to say uh, gender is essential characteristic of individual, premortal, mortal, and they say that they each have a divine nature and destiny, which is based on their gender. So the church has to say they're not equal because at this time the temple has a ceremony that says that the wife, she has to give it to her husband and not they're not equal.
That's
So
right. The husband covenants with God, and the wife covenants to the husband, making her subordinate to the husband.
correct. She
Yes.
subordinates herself, and so they can't say they're equal and then go into the temple. So it's the same wording, but they change it just slightly to say that they're, that women are. They don't say they're not equal. They just say gender plays into this. They're not quite equal.
Okay,
Yeah.
Rebecca, you are number 3.
Yep, I'm number 3. Yeah, I was going to say about that other one. Yeah, each has a special purpose, right? It's not that you're different, but you have a certain purpose, right? They
Yep.
say it so perfectly to just, take that idea from the manifesto and make it their own kind of. Okay. From the manifesto in 1988, it says, we proclaim that every child has the right to a religion and a system of values instilled from his or her earliest awareness. And 7 years later, the Family Proclamation from the LDS Church says, in the primordial realm, spirit sons and daughters knew and worshiped God as their eternal father and accepted his plan. So again, they just kind of Mormonized it, right? Instead of saying they have the right to a religion, like the evangelical said, they make it more specific. You had a primordial existence, you knew God's plan, but you should be raised with that in mind. It's kind of how I took that one.
Yeah, I would add to that that the earliest awareness from Mormonism is before you can remember it.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so you accepted this in your early so yeah, it's every child has a right, and you have a right to Mormonism. Okay.
Yeah, it shows the difference in the theology because evangelicals, you didn't exist until you were born, so your right came at birth, and Mormons say your right came from premortal existence.
Now, I want to make it clear to the audience. We're not saying that the proclamation plagiarizes this.
Mm-mm.
What we are saying is that the ideas, the need to defend, the ideas that are found in there are so similar that this is derivative of that. It's Mormonized, it's expanded, it's created to meet Mormonism. But if you look at the message is virtually the same. Okay. We deny that children are a resource of measurable value whose supply could therefore be found excessive by invalid social optimization. Basically, we deny that children should be aborted. Okay.
And that's the manifesto.
That's the manifesto. The proclamation is we declare that God's commandment for his children to multiply and replenish the earth remains in force. So the manifesto, children are not excessive. They are valid. They deserve life. They are not a resource whose supply can be found excessive. There's no such thing as excessive children. Therefore, abortion is bad. The proclamation is the command to multiply and replenish the earth remains in force. Therefore, abortion is bad. Okay. Landon, we proclaim.
We proclaim the marital relations between husband and wife are the only means of transmitting human life.
And that's the manifesto. Yeah.
That's the manifesto. The proclamation is we further declare that God has commanded that the sacred powers of procreation are to be employed only between man and woman lawfully wedded as husband and wife.
Yeah. So the only difference between this is the statement. Marital relations between husband and wife. God has declared the sacred powers of procreation only to be implied between man and woman lawfully wedded. The exact same idea, but just it was like they just added more words to it. Okay. Let's see here. You are the next one. You are 4.9.
I'm the next one. And I would still say that some of the wording is identical here and there. And I mean, the concepts, of course, broad or, a little more minute, but even some of the wording, I was surprised, that they just added a few adjectives here and there. So, I mean, we'll let our viewers and listeners decide. But to me, I've gone over it several times and I mean, things are pretty close. So this one says, and I'm reading the manifesto first. We proclaim that our children exist and deserve our protection as children from the moment we conceive them. Okay, that's the manifesto. And 7 years later, the church in its proclamation says, we affirm the sanctity of life and of its importance in God's eternal plan. So again, this is another statement like the other one, sanctity of life and protection from conception, a very important part of both documents.
It's the same idea expressed differently.
Mm-hmm.
You protect the sacred,
yeah.
right? And so all they did was swap the word deserve protection for life is sacred and important. Okay. We proclaim that children, this is the Manifesto 88, we proclaim that children are the fulfillment of marriage and a blessing to their parents. Okay. And then on the other side, 1995, husband and wife have a solemn responsibility to love and care for each of their children. Children are a heritage of the Lord. Okay, so the fulfillment of marriage is the purpose of marriage. Okay, and on the LDS side, it is responsibility to love and care for your children because they are a heritage. Well, what's a heritage? A heritage is what you come from. It's the purpose. It's what you pass down. Okay, again, the same general concept. It is the fulfillment of marriage. It's a blessing to the parents. And, it's your heritage. It's what you carry with you. It's what you give on. You have a responsibility to keep it safe. Okay. Landon, you are next.
Okay. The manifesto.
4.3.
Yeah. We proclaim that husband and wife have the responsibility and the inalienable right to rear their own children. And then the proclamation. Children are entitled to birth within the bonds of matrimony and to be reared by a father and a mother who honor marital vows with complete fidelity.
So what they've done here is they've switched it. Instead of saying that mother and father have the responsibility to rear their children, they're saying children they're entitled to a mother and father. They've just switched the language. You could very well say that mother and father have the responsibility to rear their children who are entitled to their care. Right? It's the exact same idea.
This is exactly how I wrote my papers in college.
Yep.
I'd find something that I was supposed to write about it, and then I'd reword it.
No, I mean, and the thing is, we've all done that, right? We've all looked at a quote and go, okay, I really like this quote. I don't know how to attribute it, or I don't know where it comes from. How do I rewrite it so it doesn't show up as mirroring this other quote, right? Okay, so it's stunning. So Rebecca, you are 4.6.
I'm the next one. I'm telling you, it's Chat GPT where you say, please rewrite this in a different way so it looks like God told us to do it.
Yep.
That's exactly it. Okay. Next, from the Christian Manifesto here in 88, we reject the ideologies and fashions which delude us within the hope that material things such as toys and entertainment can compensate for human interaction in the rearing of children. Okay. And then the Family Proclamation kind of says it in a different way. Successful marriages and families are established and maintained on principles of faith, prayer, repentance, forgiveness, respect, love, compassion, work, and wholesome recreational activities. And I will add that the manifesto part of it almost sounds like no success can compensate for the failure within the home, right? It's just this idea that what you do in the home is the most important. So the very same concept.
Yeah. So, the ideologies and fashions, wholesome recreation activities, it's basically saying that the focus should be above these distractions, right? And then I'll go for the next. We proclaim, this is 2.3, we proclaim that the role of the male is most effectively that of provider, and the role of female is one of nurture. Okay? And then the Family Proclamation says, by divine design, fathers are to preside over their families in love and righteousness, and are responsible to provide the necessities of life and protection for their families. So most effectively, that of provider. Mothers are primarily responsible for the role of nurture of their children. Now, this has always been fascinating to me, right? Because this is the male concept is so much more fleshed out, which tells you that women had no say in this, right? Because it's like a bunch of guys in the room go, "Hey, what are we supposed to do? Oh,
Do women
we
do?
love our families and we're righteous and we provide and we give protection." So that's the guys. And what do the women do? Oh, well,
Yeah.
they nurture.
Yeah.
They make us cookies while we're at priesthood session. Okay.
Surprised they didn't
Print
add
it.
make donuts, right? That's what they should have added there. But they did use the same words in both.
Yes.
Provide in both for the
And
husband and
nurture.
nurture in both for the wife.
Yeah,
So
with no deviation as to the concept of either, by the way.
Yep.
Right. Okay, so Landon, you are 5.1.
Okay, the manifesto. We proclaim that this situation is an achievable goal toward which, apart from grave criminal cases, our energies should be directed. And then the proclamation, disability, death, or other circumstances may necessitate individual adaptation. So they're kind of given the out. These situations may differ if one of these things happen.
Well, it's an achievable goal with a little bit of leeway. And so what they've done is basically say this is an achievable goal, but you may have to adapt yourself. So again, it's the same concept reworded, right? One just is more verbose than the other, but it's the same concept. All right, Rebecca, you're up.
Yep, let's see. Okay. From the Manifesto, 1988, we proclaim that in order for its uniqueness and its irreplaceable identity, the extended family must be of economic importance to its members. So they're talking about support, right? And all the different people that could support the family. Proclamation, 7 years later, says the same kind of thing. Extended families should lend support when needed. So they're both talking about the extended family. I'm telling you, if you did a word by word comparison, some of these are so similar, but that idea that the buy-in from the extended family, right? Everybody has to support the nuclear family, the raising of children in righteousness, either evangelical or Mormonism. And it's really important that extended families on all sides, support. It's all part of it.
And these are too unique to just be coincidence.
Exactly.
Extended family, nurture,
Provide.
Provide. We proclaim. Too close.
Every professor has had and with cheating papers. If you were a professor and you had a student who said, "I'm going to write a family manifesto here," and a student who said, "I'm going to write a family proclamation here," and you came in and you put them side by side, you would look at this and go, what are the odds?
One of you borrowed.
What are the odds that you would have 11 items that, while not exactly the same wording, are the exact same concept, just reworded? In some case, exchanging the exact same language. And there's one example in here, which we'll get to, which is so blatant. We all struggle with it.
And not just that, but using the same format where you're going, we proclaim, we solemnly proclaim, we
declare,
we deny, all these terms are being used in both. And then you even named it Family Manifesto, Family Proclamation. No doubt one of these came from the other.
Okay. I think I'm next.
You are.
So this is the 1988 Manifesto. We reject those manifestations of antisocial attitudes and values which are much in evidence in popular culture, specifically hostility towards authority, promiscuous self-indulgence, and utilization of others for self-gratification. On the Family Proclamation, it states, "We warn that individuals who violate the covenants of chastity, otherwise known as values which are evidence which are promiscuous self-indulgence and utilization of others for self-gratification, who abuse spouse or offspring," okay, which is, hostility, or fail to fulfill family responsibilities, stand accountable to God. So they take the exact same concept, they whittle it down a little bit, talking about the law of chastity, and then they add a idea of judgment on top of it, which I don't think shows up in the Family Proclamation, in the manifesto. But again,
and I was going to say that chastity shows up way more, of course, because the LDS are obsessed with chastity. So that has to be part of it, And then when it says, self-gratification, and that means shirking your responsibilities, basically. So it is the very same thing with a little dose of chastity reminder, of course, thrown in there. And you better do what you signed up to do, and that is care for your family, be faithful, and live in that.
And I would point to that those who abuse spouse and offspring, those are antisocial attitudes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay, so Landon, you are next, 7.5.
Okay, manifesto. For the good of our nation, for the good of society, and for the good of each human being individually. The proclamation, further we warn that the disintegration of the family will bring upon individuals, communities, and nations the calamities foretold by ancient and modern prophets.
Okay. For the good of our nation, for the good of society, and each individual. Otherwise, the calamities will be upon individuals, communities, and nations. Yep. Exact same language and
just
expanded
reversed.
Concept.
It's a chiasmus, right? That's exactly it. It's right
this
there.
Is how you do this when you start copying other stuff. You just flip the sentences and go say it in reverse order. It's what you do when you're trying to rewrite something differently.
Okay. So, Rebecca, you are up next.
Yep, we're almost to the end here. Yes, so the Manifesto, 1988, says, we proclaim that the institution of marriage must be upheld by society in prestige, recognized by law, in suitable statutes, and protected by government in public policy. That's an important one. And, of course, the Family Proclamation from the church in 1995, we call upon responsible citizens and officers of government everywhere to promote those measures designed to maintain and strengthen the family. So here they are saying we must protect this by the suitable statutes recognized by the law. We call upon officers of the government and citizens. Is exactly the same thing.
Yeah, it's the exact same idea. It's reworded. It's definitely distinct, but it's the exact same idea. Like I said, you could run this through ChatGPT and give me 5 different ways to explain this concept, and it would punch out 2 of these. Now, this is my favorite.
Yeah,
this is my favorite one. I'm really happy that I was hoping I'd be able to read this one. And if you're not watching on the screen, those of you who can see it on the screen, you've already read it at the very bottom. I guarantee you're already like gripping a stuffed animal and squeezing it because you can't believe this. But this is the last quote. 1988, the Family Manifesto. We proclaim that the family is the fundamental unit of society. Okay? 1995, the Family Proclamation. The family is the fundamental unit of society.
Let's all do a mic drop. Pick up your mic, drop it. There you go. Oh my, yeah. When I read that, there was no doubt right there. At that point, they just gave up. They said, you know what? They said it so well. We can't really change that. It's really impactful. We're just going to,
Oakes and Nelson wanted lunch and the meeting had gone too long.
So that sounds fine.
But yeah, so I mean, it's wild. So I mean, the thing I want people to take away from this is that a lot of what we have in the church, when we're branded with, hey, this is ahead of its time, all that stuff, that narrative is put out there so that you will look at it and that you will automatically give deference to the leaders as being ahead of their time, and it will continue your faith in them and their positions of authority and power. Okay? Joseph Smith did it all the time. This document's the same way. Like I said, I can't show where Norm Bangerter or Orrin Hatch handed a copy of this off to Russell M. Nelson in 1988 and said, hey, this is really interesting. We got this at the convention. You might want to look into this. We do know that the Freeman Institute through Skousen had copies of this because he was very close with Falwell, and they exchanged information and documentation. And we do know that major business leaders and Republican Party officials who were at the 88 conference received copies of this, and they would have brought it home to Utah and talked about it and discussed it and handed it around. And we do know that when you do a side-by-side comparison of this document, which was contemporaneous to the church's issues, which was in reaction to expansions of LGBTQ recognition and community action across the country, when you compare it side by side with the Family Proclamation, you see that the items are the same. So a apologist, a member of the church will say, well, you have to prove that they had access to it. Just like they say, well, you have to prove that Joseph Smith had access to the Bible dictionary or any of that other stuff. We don't have to prove that they had access to it. We just have to show that the possibility that they had access to it is the most likely explanation for why this exists. And for me, my position is they knew about it, they referenced it, they used it as a template, and they moved forward from there. It wasn't a big deal in Utah. It wasn't covered in the press in Utah very much. And then when it came time to roll it out as a revelation, they cannot say that this document influenced what they did without undermining their own authority. And the narrative that was put out there, in my opinion, is false and misleading. So that's my spiel.
Yeah.
I've come up with a new name for Mormon Jesus, the great plagiarizer, because he clearly this has clearly been plagiarized. Now, in fairness, we should point out these numbers over here. You know, if you compare the two, it's not like these go line by line.
Right.
This was, paragraph 3.1 in the Family Manifesto corresponds with paragraph 1 in the Family Proclamation, paragraph 2.1 with paragraph 2. So when you read it, I mean, obviously the Family Manifesto was like 4 pages long. The Family Proclamation, I don't know, 1 or 2 pages long, depending on, where you print it at. So there are other words in here than just these words that we compared, but the chances of these words being used in this role, this closely put together with two documents that were clearly referencing the family for amicus briefs for the exact same purpose by 2 different groups that had clearly cross-contamination with the Republican Party, even the Democratic Party, and with leaders of the church who
And
politically
every
were aligned.
pro-family group in Utah.
Yeah.
Every pro-family group.
Yeah.
The Eagle Forum would have had it. And how many Mormons in Utah do you know that were associated with the Eagle Forum and Gail Ruzicka over the years? What's the name of the big conservative think tank there? What's it called? The Sutherland
Sutherland Institute.
Yeah.
Yeah. They would have had, if they existed, any group like that would have had access to this. Okay.
Many of which are run by top level Mormon leaders.
Exactly.
There's no way they had not seen this or didn't know what it was and said, we need our own one of these that's like theirs, and that's where this came from.
And how many Mormons are attorneys, and what a big deal it was throughout the 1990s to get into these into these cases, right? And so they would have been looking for something that worked. More importantly, they would have been looking for something that echoed enough with the evangelical communities that the evangelical communities would join with them in these court cases, and that is exactly what has happened. They echoed evangelical language in their document, and that way the evangelical parties would have a buy-in with them to go to court for these cases, and you see that with the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church joins in on these cases. Okay? And they file with evangelical groups now across the country all the time, so that's what they were doing here, and that's what where this document is from. Now, for the believer that's watching this doesn't mean you can't say that they were inspired to pull it, because I think that the approach of the firm foundation or fair LDS will be, they'll say, well, a lot of revelations were predicated upon social events. We've shown that, right? And then, they'll say, well, this is just proof that the Lord gives you the tools you need, and you have to make it work from there. So there's all kinds of apologetic ways to make this work. Now, for somebody like me who doesn't believe that that's the case, the most logical explanation is that they used this as a template. They knew it existed. They wanted to craft language that would create a buy-in from the evangelical community, and they did it with this.
Yeah, I think you've absolutely hit it on the head. And of course, there is that idea in the LDS Church that light and truth is given to other Christian organizations, other groups. So maybe this is an example of that. And it was simply a catalyst, right? We love that word in Mormonism. The Evangelical Family Manifesto was a catalyst for the Family Proclamation. But again, the reason that we're talking about this, like I said, so many articles about the proclamation of the family, and very specifically the article that I found that was taken down, that went through the steps and the events, almost as if they don't want to make that super clear or available to the faithful right there, because that article was taken down within 24 hours of being published. It was written by an intern. I looked up this little guy, intern, used to work at the Daily Universe, and they took it down. And the title of it was The Events That Led to, the crafting of the proclamation. And I think they just don't want that out there. And so why would that
be? Was the Family Manifesto mentioned in that timeline?
No, that's what I'm saying. Neither was Hawaii. The only thing that was mentioned there was how the women were prayerful and the women were involved, things like that. I just don't think, that's not true, as we know. And I don't think they want any kind of timeline. A timeline makes it look like it's not your lighted pen revelation, right? A timeline is you worked on it for a long time. Now, here's my question for Jim. So the fact that they took this article away, the fact that they have so many other articles about it, I feel something big, some kind of recognition is going to happen at conference, right? I don't know if it will be canonization. That is a little extreme, although now with President Oaks kind of at the helm and it's his baby, maybe. But I do feel there are going to be many mentions of it, singing its praises. So given everything we've talked about in this whole podcast, Jim, what would you hope that, maybe post-Mormons, nuanced Mormons might be able to, look critically at what's said at conference, maybe take some of this information to faithful family members? How should we use what we learned here on this podcast to kind of react or synthesize what we're most likely going to hear, kind of the fable or the fairy tale of the proclamation that we're going to hear at conference?
Okay, so my reaction to that would be is I don't think that they'll canonize it. I think they've already come as close to canonization as they can possibly get by proclaiming it revelatory and everything else. They've got stuff, like I showed on the church website, that says it's already doctrine. Now, there was that weird post from Holland that said that there's new scripture coming.
Yes, I put that out. It did. He was holding the Book of Mormon. He goes, "We love this. And there's 100 times more of this. And we should be able to read, what we have here. And there's more scripture coming, everybody. I love you." That's what he said. So I know I have it memorized. Isn't that creepy? But I do.
So it's weird because they haven't hinted at new scripture ever. Since Oliver Cowdery was told not to translate.
Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah, I forgot about it, but that's huge.
So if they do canonize it, they will be canonizing it so that they can appear to be more conservative for the converts that are coming on board in Africa and other places where they are trying to really present this family thing. They will be doing that at the expense of members in the United States that have LGBTQ children. They know that they're going to lose some of those, but the canonization of the proclamation of the family would tie very closely into what we talked about last week with the Jesus land and the whole 9 yards, because then they can say, here is Jesus, here is his plan for you, and here is his plan for your family. And in a time of uncertainty, what everybody wants to know is whether their loved ones are okay. And so if they do canonize it, I think that's the reason, is because they want to tie that in with the temple redesign, all that kind of stuff, to give people reasons to attend the temple. Because right now, I think when they hand somebody a Book of Mormon or Doctrine and Covenants and they say, "Oh, and here's this on top of that," it's a little bit confusing. You
Mhm.
have this extra document. What does this extra document mean, right? So if they're going to canonize it, that would be the reason. Um, but I think what you're going to see is more celebration of the 30th anniversary. It's going to be more lip service. It's going to be more how great this is. And they will continue to reinforce its semi-canonical status because right now it's semi-canonical. They've said it's revelatory. They've given it the status without actually giving it the status. So for the individuals who have watched this, one, don't fight with your family members. It's not worth it. You're not going to change their minds. You're not going to do anything by bringing this up in a negative way. My response would be if it comes up and people are talking to you about it, you say, it's really interesting because in 1988 there was this other document as well, and we can say that it was a deal, and the church also had their own document, and you can address that in a way to engage conversation without being accusatory. We don't have to say, well, the church plagiarized this, right? Address your family with respect. Address them with the fact that they don't know that this exists. So introduce it and talk about it and talk about the social situations that led to it. But for God's sakes, don't fight with your family.
Especially
Like,
not on conference
yeah,
weekend, right?
not
So
a conference weekend. It
it's
should be
such a good
peaceful.
point. It's such a good point that you make, though, Jim. And exactly the idea of aligning yourself more with the Christian right, and all the other things that we've talked about that align your Mormonism with the Christian light, right? I mean, if you haven't watched our episode from last week about Jesus Land, take a look there. And there's been even more things that have come out since then. But it does remind me of what happened in the Methodist Church a couple years ago, which was exactly that. They have worldwide votes on policies, and it was, to allow same-sex marriage kind of a thing within the church. And there was everybody outside of the United States, like you said absolutely not. And this is a simplified version of what happened, but inside the United States, they said, of course, there was a schism because of this difference. Like you said, inside of the United States, a very different view on all of that. So
Yeah,
that makes me think. That makes me really wonder about
the
that. Yeah.
social opinions of
Mm-hmm.
members in the United States. I mean, if you look at some of the opinions, like you got a lot of young BYU students who
Uh-huh.
accept gay
Yep.
marriage. They're okay with it. They're much more nuanced than the other generation. They do not carry over if you go to Africa or the places where the church is actually growing.
Exactly. And that's what
You know?
happened with the Methodists. They actually had to split their church because their ideologies were so different. The
Right.
other problem, of course, and most of you guys have probably thought this out, if they canonize it, I guarantee, at least I predict, someday same-sex sealings in some way are going to be allowed in the LDS church. It just has to go that way, just like the priesthood ban. Now, imagine if there had been something canonized, that would stop them from lifting the priesthood ban. They had to go back through everything to find, oh, this was not a revelation. This was not. So it would be idiotic to canonize it because they could never dial it back once they do that. Right now, they can. They can kind of skate back and say, it was just kind of a
Well,
policy. It was kind of
if
this
they
wiggle room.
wanted to do that, they would not be pushing it as hard as they are now. They
I
are
know.
leaning into this. They are
I think
leaning
some of
into.
them are. I think a few are. Others are probably like, oh, be careful.
Well,
I don't know.
look at all the publications.
Yeah,
The
no, I
church,
know.
the church newsroom does not publish stuff that is not approved by the brethren. It's not part of the messaging. And as we've seen, the messaging for Jesus Land and all the concepts behind that goes back, 5 years.
Yeah.
They are pushing the proclamation of the family. They are leaning into it. LDS Daily, I think, had an article about how the proclamation of the family influenced other pro-family proclamations, right?
Oh,
And they
that's
give, like,
funny.
I think it was the Doha proclamation or something like that. Of course, they don't mention that it was influenced by another one, but
Exactly.
um, they are leaning into the proclamation. You've got nine articles that you've noticed just in a little while. I think Jasmine Rapley did something about it a little while
Yeah.
back. So the marching orders have gone out that this is what they want to push, and they can't push the proclamation without pushing the definitions in the proclamation, which make it abundantly clear that there's really no room in the church for LGBTQ individuals. They're never going to have the same thing that the heterosexual members have. And if they canonize it, which they might, because they're hedging their bets on growth in Africa, they're not hedging their bets in
Yeah.
growth in the United States, they're
True.
not hedging their bets on growth in Europe. Um, if they do that, it is the absolute death nail
Hmm.
to LGBT members who want to be included in their faith community.
I'd take that even a step further, because this is not just LGBTQ unfriendly. This is unfriendly if you're never married.
Hmm.
It's unfriendly if you're divorced. It's unfriendly if you grow up in a family where a parent died and remarried, and now you're coming from two different families and merging. Uh, it's unfriendly to every type of family that is not the standard nuclear family where everything goes just right for.
Yeah.
And members that are in that, which is going to be the majority of members, uh, are going to end up being in one of those other relationships, are going to say, where do I fit in with this church? And of course, the church's answer has always been, God will work all that out in the end. Don't worry about it. Yeah, well, you can make that same argument for LGBTQ then, if you allow them and just say, hey, God will work it all out in the end. Be happy on earth and he'll figure it out afterwards. You could make that same argument. But
Pay
that to
your
me is where
tithing and
this
you'll get
hurts.
it after you die.
Yeah.
Yep.
Just keep paying your tithing. You must have read that article, one of the 9 or 13 that Jim's talking about, because one of them in the church news said, not seeing yourself in the proclamation, right? So I'm like, well, now that's interesting. What does that mean? Exactly what you said, Landon. I mean, it's so funny because last time I saw a stat, 51% of the women in the church were single, whether that's never married, divorced, widowed, that's your demographic. And this article that said finding yourself was about a woman who hadn't gotten married or had children. So she was having a hard time seeing herself. Of course, then she did get married and have children, so it was fine. And just wait, like you said, Landon, it will all be fine. Kick the football, kick the can down the way a little bit, wait till the next life, and you'll be okay.
Yeah.
The article didn't address anything that you said, Landon, but it's a legitimate question.
It doesn't address Wendy Nelson or what's Oak's wife's name?
Kristen, second polygamous
Kristen
wife.
Oakes.
Yes.
Neither one of them fall within this, because they're the second wife of
Right.
somebody
And never
in the
married and
fraternity.
never had children.
And didn't have children.
And then married a second wife.
Yep.
Yeah.
What's really fascinating is going back to that master plan episode, how many times do we see that language of seeing yourself?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Right?
true.
They're really leaning heavily into this personalization, this concept that you should be able to look at every aspect, see yourself in the Book of Mormon. Like, how does Nephi's, killing Laban appeal to you? Or, so yeah, this is all part of the rebrand, and it would be interesting to take a look at the messaging on the Proclamation of the Family and see if we can find elements of rebrand in that. I might do that just for the shiggles this week.
Get busy in original, Jim. That's right. Another assignment. The bottom line is we will be watching very closely this weekend at what they are going to do and say about the proclamation. And I feel like almost every talk will have something about that. Although then I do wonder, now that President Nelson has passed away, if maybe they are rewriting some things. Maybe that thunder's a little stolen because they're going to be talking about, the turnover, the new prophet. I mean, basically anything could happen. I think this is going to be hard to predict.
My biggest plan for conference is I have got a growler here, and I'm going to be taking a shot of every single time they say President Nelson or our beloved prophet. So I might be dead.
Proclamation. That's it.
Yeah.
So nobody try to reach out to or text Jim this weekend, because it's just he's not going to be able to answer. So.
Reach out to me on TikTok. Make sure I'm okay.
That's right. Yeah. And I hope that you guys all check out Unoriginal Jim's TikToks and any other platforms you want to talk about, because you are just so fascinating. And we're all just so on the same page of the stuff that we're looking at. And I just love your dedication and your research skills and abilities and your ability to present. It's really awesome. I'm glad that we get to collaborate. So talk just a little bit about your own platforms so that people can find you when he does do other things other than Mormonish.
Yeah. So, I started the TikTok a while back, and it would start off as a cathartic way for me to talk through things. What I've done is I've taken issues that I'm passionate about. So if I'm talking about the mound builder myth, which is something I've been studying, I do TikToks on that, and I'll kind of walk through the historical documents that are on that. I have another one where I talk about the history of the church's involvement in anti-pornography issues. Right? And how the church actually led an anti-pornography crusade in California in 1978. and then used that exact same platform, that exact same method on Proposition 8. So they tried to change the state constitution for Proposition 18 in 1978, and they used the exact same methods for Prop 8 later. And so I kind of go through these issues that I've associated with, I have documentation on, and show where the documentation is. I try not to be antagonistic. My goal is not to make anybody feel stupid and make anybody feel dumb or make anybody think that they are less than for believing anything. But for me, it's whether or not I can find the documentation or the data to back it up. And if I can't, then my position is usually that, it's you need to question it. And I want people to question. I think that if God exists, God wants you to have the best information possible so you can make the most informed decision possible. And that a God that does not give you all the information to make the best decisions is not a God that's working in your best interest. And so it's where I basically come at it from that position. So the TikTok is really where I try to have those conversations. I try not to be really antagonistic. I've gotten a lot of shit on there over the last little while. But reach out to me, say hi. I'd be happy to answer questions for people or engage. If someone wants to collaborate on something or they have something that they want to kind of dig into, I'm more than happy to do that. And Landon and Rebecca, I can say that over the last, 6 months, I have had more fun working on our projects than I have for any research project I've done in the last few years. And I'm really excited that where this is going.
Yes.
And I'm probably going to be out there in December. I've got some Delta Sky Miles I've got to burn up.
Awesome.
But I let's just keep doing this. This has been a lot of fun.
No, it is. We'll have to go out to dinner again. We always have interesting conversations that lead to multiple podcasts. And I would say that Unoriginal Jim just leaves no stone unturned, which is why everything becomes a rabbit hole, but that's awesome. So please, everybody comment on what you thought about this episode. And then once you watch Conference or watch RFM or Nemo's recap, jump back on, to the comments and let's get a dialogue going on what actually was said compared to what we talked about here, or go on Mormonish Podcast Facebook page. Just if you make an observation and say, oh my gosh, you guys said they would do this, or, oh, you were totally full of it. Nothing you said happened, just let us know what you think, because I think it's important that we all, bring our skill sets to just kind of look at this and kind of debunk it, just, so the information is out there. That's all we want to do. So please comment. Yeah. Now and after the fact, please like and subscribe to Mormonish Podcast. And if you'd like to be made aware of when new episodes come out, you can hit the notification bell. If you would like to help financially support Mormonish Podcast, we always have links in our show notes, and you guys are just the absolute best. We just appreciate you so much. I cannot say it enough. You guys just rock. And we really, really appreciate you, those of you that donate, and everybody. We also have links to our merch store to grab a Mormonish mug or something that you want. And again, thank you so much, Unoriginal Jim. Another fantastic presentation. Landon, whose work schedule has sort of evened out a little. Has it, Landon? A little?
We'll see.
It is super nice to see your face, man.
I know.
You,
I made the joke that I had somebody text me and go, what happened to that co-host Brandon of yours?
Brandon Lofi, that's right.
Brandon Lofi, yeah, his name is Landon. Yeah, and I keep trying to explain to people, but they're like, I sure miss him. Well, hopefully he's back. Hopefully, now here we go, because we love to all collaborate together. So we will see all of you next time, everybody, after conference on Mormonish Podcast. Thanks all. Thanks for joining us for another episode of Mormonish. We really appreciate our listeners and would love to hear from you if you have a story you'd like to share. You can email us at mormonishpodcast@gmail.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Instagram, and on our website, mormonishpodcast.org. And don't forget to look for us on YouTube and like and subscribe. Keep joyful, everybody.